Hello, everyone. Good evening from Japan. Welcome to SCoT or welcome back to SCoT. We are with you today with a new webinar, which is got a very important title, which is climate change. The webinar today we have is moderated by Dr. Chen, and he is a speaker today, are going to present the impacts of climate change on tourism destinations. The webinar is not only important as a global level, but also in local level and for the local communities, as this webinar series emphasized on. Dr. Chen is Professor of Tourism, Hospitality, and Event Management at the School of Public Health, Indiana University. He has many journal articles, books, and book chapters in the field. And he has a text titled Sustainability in Hospitality Industry, which is used by tourism students in many universities. Without taking more time, I would like to pass on to the president of SCoT, Professor Jafar Jafari, to enlighten us with the opening remark for tonight's webinar. Jafar, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. While it is evening at your end or night at your end, it's early morning here. Good morning to everybody. As you already mentioned, we are dealing with the local cases in tourism. What most people don't realize that tourism is not always concerned about large destinations. In reality, small destinations, if you put them together, small operators, small destinations, if you put them together, they are larger than the mega developments. And usually the little ones are forgotten. The little destinations, the little communities involved in tourism, little villages in tourism, small operators are often forgotten. And that's when we decided to have this webinar series to concentrate on smallness and small destinations and small communities. And so far, almost all of our 60 webinars have dealt with that subject. While the climate change is a universal issue, but we try to bring it down to the level of smaller communities. The other thing that I would like to mention as an introduction for those who are joining us for the first time in the webinar series, this webinar series is not all about theory, but it's also about practice. What is, just to give you an example, Annals of Tourism Research recently published an article by McRacher, saying that in the year 2021, over 10,000 journal articles on tourism appeared in tourism journals. Over 10,700 appeared. I wonder what percentage of this were read by the practitioners. My guess is not even 1%. So what I'm trying to say is there's a breakdown between theory and practice. We are generating all these theories and we are circulating them among ourselves, and we are publishing more articles. So I hope we bring down our theories to the level of practitioners, especially small towns and communities and destinations involved in tourism. I just checked also on climate change a few minutes ago in one of the journals, Annals of Tourism Research, and I just put the keywords climate change in tourism. There are 735 articles that are dealing with climate change and tourism in one single journal. So we know a lot about the subject. Hopefully we can bring it down to earth and help small communities to become aware of what climate change is, what it's doing, what it might be doing, what are the harms, what are the measures we have to make. And a challenge that I would like to offer to us for today's discussion is that can we deal with climate change issues without talking about culture change? I'm a culture anthropologist. And if the culture doesn't change, no matter how much of technology we have, it's not going to help us a lot. So we need to have deal with culture change and climate change together in order to bring down the issues that are disturbing us in the years to come in regards to climate change. I don't want to say any more because I'm here also to learn about climate change myself. And I think in one of our earlier SCoT webinar series, we had another webinar about a year and a half ago, which dealt with climate change. So this is more or less adding to the subject in that sense. So I'm here to learn, and I will have I come back to at the end of the webinar with some questions maybe, or some summary comments. Kazem, back to you.
Thank you, Jafar. As always, very short and right to the point. Without any ado, I would like to ask Professor Joseph Chen to enlighten us with the webinar. Professor Chen, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be invited by the small community to host a climate change discussion today. So I'd invite 3 speakers today, and before I do that, I want to pretty much talk about my experience in this area regarding climate change observation. So Arctic is one of my research area, and so I've been maybe doing my work in the Arctic region, like in Norway, Iceland, Greenland, Alaska, for 15 years. In the last 15 years, personally, I do feel the effect of climate change in the Arctic, and also I've done quite a few interviews. Most of them qualitative study on climate change in the Arctic, and also it is the fact everybody recognize climate change is not a hoax; it's real anyway. Surprisingly, in the Arctic region, people really develop a strategy. I mean, to obtain the climate change trend, so that is a quite amazing story. But however, from today's discussion, we're going to listen different story from different part of the world. Of course, another one also relate to the Arctic, which is the presentation from Norway. So we're also going to listen that, talk about the new perspectives regarding the resilience, human resilience, coping with climate change issue. So today we have 3 distinguished speakers here. Professor Bruce Priddock from Australia, and Professor Colin Johnson from United States, California, and also Gudrun Hegadottir from Norway. So we're going to start the first panel discussion from Norway. Then from Norway, we move to Australia. Then we come back to California. Okay, Gudrun, okay, floor is yours.
Thank you. You hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. I'm going to talk about tourism and climate change in the Arctic from really a multi or sort of interdisciplinary perspective. I have this presentation is based on work that I've been doing with my colleagues in the Rural Tourism Department at Hólar University College in Iceland, which is my native country, and with my colleagues in the University of Southeast Norway, both in tourism and climate change and light design and optometry. So this is quite interdisciplinary, but first I want to give some background to the situation in the Arctic. Now this is a the view from my office a few years ago. Beautiful, idyllic Nordic winter. But I want to draw your attention to the mean temperature increase, land and sea, in black, covering that beautiful snowbank there. That in the Arctic region, this is 3 times higher than the global average. But that doesn't really tell the whole story, because as Jafar mentioned, it is the local ecosystems, the regional ecosystems, and regional and local communities that where things happen and where practices are actually carried out. So that's what we need to focus on. But the cases that I want to talk about, they are on 2 aspects. On one hand, the Arctic light and natural light in the Arctic, and the other hand, Arctic char. And they are really to illustrate aspects of climate change that haven't enjoyed too much attention, whether that is because they are barely discernible to the human senses, or whether it's because they are indirect. I leave open to question. But for us, it's important to illustrate the complexity of these relations and how they relate to an industry such as tourism. Now, as a professor at a business school and responsible for a program in master program in sustainability management, I'm of course concerned with these relations with industry and with trying to get the tools of the management trade to be applied to bring about the necessary transitions to adapt and mitigate climate change. Now, just the background on what is happening in the Arctic. These points are taken from a recent, the last year's report from the Arctic Council, Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And you probably know this, so I'm just going to highlight what it means for tourism. For tourism in this region, this seasonality changes are very crucial, because the Arctic communities are very dependent on winter tourism, and the extreme weather events and changing weather patterns affect the seasonality. And the ecosystems changes that are happening, they are both in the productivity, in the seasonal rhythms, and the distribution and interaction with species. This means that there are disrupted value chains, of which the Arctic char can be an example. There is biodiversity. Excuse me?
You want us to share the slides, or?
I'm sorry about that. My apologies. No, I can do that, but I just simply forgot about it. So my sincere apologies to the audience.
It happens to us too.
Yeah, let me just see if I can just share the slides. I'm sorry about that. I will show you again the beautiful view from my office window. So this is what Norwegians say is the good winter image, but unfortunately we don't see as much of it as before, as I mentioned, and this is the report that I'm referring to, and what I was at the point of biodiversity loss, and that could mean disappearing attractions, because both animals, plants can disappear because of the northward migration of species due to warming of the climate. It also means that invasive species can replace the indigenous species, which of course changes the landscape, changes the attraction to such an extent that it loses its experience value. There are also risks to health, safety, and well-being. Now, the Nordic countries, for instance, are perceived as very safe, but with extreme weather events, we are facing avalanches and floods that risk the lives of tourists and tour operators, both their businesses and their customers. And with the self-drive and self-directed tourism, we have also the added challenge of tourists that are not familiar with such weather conditions, are unprepared, do not know the road conditions. So in my research in Iceland, I have discovered that that local people are often very concerned about the safety of tourists in these conditions. There's also pressure on infrastructure. There's damage of infrastructure, roads and bridges are washed away with floods, and this costs, of course, for businesses and for the communities. And another point that is important both in Iceland and Norway is that search and rescue, for instance, is carried out mainly by volunteers. So these increased risks, these increased incidences of risk incidences are actually putting pressure on the local communities because the volunteers are actually overwhelmed with this situation. So it has adverse economic impacts, both locally in the communities and municipalities and businesses, even in the non-profit sector, and also, of course, for nations like Iceland that are very where tourism is one of the main industries. But I want to talk about water, especially air and water. By the way, if nothing is mentioned, if there's no photographer mentioned, it's my own work, and this is what is the backdrop, really, that the air temperatures, they are warming very strongly in winter, particularly, although there are local variations. But the average temperature, the global, the big picture is not going to tell the practitioners on the ground very much, because for a local tourism operator in Norway, the global temperature doesn't tell that person very much, because in that case, in the fjord where he or she is operating, it may happen way faster than the global average, but it may happen slower than in the next fjord, depending on the topography and microclimate. So I think microclimate is something that we really need to, in the small tourism operators' mind, we need to focus on that. And also freshwater temperatures, of course, they are delayed and subtler and can be, to some degree, mitigate. But water, liquid and solid, that is really the key one of the key attractions in the Arctic. And there are, of course, issues with climate, with the warming climate. There is pollution, there's eutrophication, sorry. There's a typo there, the algae blooming in freshwater. There's loss of wetland. The glaciers are disappearing, and the ice cover and the snow. So, but there are different ecosystems and different stories. But the big picture is that instead of pristine snow, ice on the lakes and clear skies with the northern lights dancing, many tourists will meet the same as my colleagues from Universidad de Valle, Guatemala, who were visiting overcast sky, the snow is melting, it's only covering part of the ground. So although that was snow for them, it's not really what we see in what we've marketed and what we've built our winter tourism on. But what is important here is to think about what is the actual local ecosystem and what kind of changes are we seeing in each location. But if we talk about those two, because astrotourism, northern light tourism, is a huge market for particularly northern Norway, northern Sweden, all of the Arctic is very much a destination for astrotourism. But we also have promoted the bright nights, the long summer nights when the sun doesn't set. So these seasonal variations, this is one of the key things, key attractions to the Nordic to the Arctic area is that huge difference in darkness and in daylight length. And with the changing weather patterns, we are experiencing a more evening out. We are seeing the winters are as much milder. There's more precipitation. That means you will not have the sky and you will not have the snow cover that has been so important for this winter landscape. And in the summers, they can become much too dry. And with the warmer climate, of course, the species that are invading our areas make the landscapes more like the landscape of our target markets. So this is changing the landscape in which tourism operates to a great degree. Moving from another thing that I wanted to mention with the natural Arctic light as a resource is that one of the things that are threatening this experience, even in small communities, is our excessive use of light. There is a lot of light pollution in the, particularly, of course, in affluent societies. But it is also very culturally dependent, because in the Nordic and the northern regions, light is, of course, seen as good, inherently good. The more light, the better. The more light, the safer. So here in Norway, there is a huge debate about people even have lights on in second homes where nobody, even when they're not there, because now the LED technology has made light so cheap. So we are also, in a sense, harming our own ability to enjoy the winter nights with excessive light. The Arctic char is a case of a species that, as the name implies, is Arctic. It did actually exist also in mountainous areas in other parts of Europe, but it is vulnerable, sensitive to climate change. So it has had a northward migration. So now it's mostly found in the northernmost parts of the globe. And it's a way of maybe taking this global warming issue not only down to earth, as Jafar mentioned, but also down to water, is that this is a signature species that was very, very important traditionally as a food source all year round in the Arctic communities. Now it's, of course, disappearing from a great many lakes because of the global warming, but it's still a signature species in the tourism and hospitality sector. It is on the menus of restaurants. It's a part of the movement of new Nordic food was, of course, focusing on local food, and the Arctic char is a local species that has enjoyed quite popularity. But it also is very important, and it is very adaptable. So it has a great many variations in morphs that are locally adapted. So it is actually very important in terms of evolutionary biology and freshwater ecology. So in terms of trying to understand and illustrate how our ecosystems develop, this fish actually can teach us a lot. So it has the added value of having local variation, and it's a natural history wonder, but it's also an instance of a very historical moment. We are actually domesticating fish in historical times. That's the only animal that we are domesticating in historical times is fish. So that is also something that is a bit valued as a theoretical perspective on aquaculture. So, in conclusion, it's a question: is this situation that we are now facing in the Arctic and with Arctic tourism in the era in the Anthropocene, is it kind of a last chance tourism, or is it a learning experience? And learning experience, of course, is a bit ambiguous term because we often speak of unfortunate events as learning experiences. And in our research, we've focused on these cases. Will we see the Arctic night sky in the future? Well, that may be so, but we at least have to turn off the lights, which is also maybe a sustainability issue in itself. And whether we have ice and snow to play in, it depends very much on the snow production, artificial snow production, unfortunately. And the Arctic char, likewise, will it be on the menu? It will mostly be farmed, and it will possibly be shipped from around the world, because as it disappears from the local areas, it may be shipped to Iceland from Chile or from Iceland to Norway. And that, of course, has implications for CO2 emissions and transport costs. But is it all dark? Are there any opportunities here? Perhaps this learning experience is the key. We have a lot to tell in terms of natural heritage, the species migration, the vanishing glaciers, the very visible, tangible impacts of climate change is something that we can actually show people, tell people about. So instead of holding up this image of the glacier as it was 20 years ago, maybe we now need to say to people, come and see what happens, come and see the changes. Likewise, with the cultural heritage, the implications of this is that we have disasters, we have washed out roads, we have empty villages and lost lifestyles, but the lights might still be on in the second homes. And that's also a cultural change that is something to consider and possibly be part of the story that we need to tell the world. And that is very much part, of course, of the Arctic culture, is the storytelling. So maybe we need to turn to storytelling as the experience that we are offering when we can no longer offer the Northern Lights experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. Dr. Chen, you're muted.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Hegadati, for your captivating presentation. Now we try to move the discussion to the different time zone, to Australia. I guess it is quite close to midnight right now. To the Golden Coast. Professor Bruce Prudup, going to present his view on the climate change. Hi, Bruce, you are unmute. Can you unmute? Yes. I cannot hear you. Can you turn on your speaker?
Sorry, I just lost you. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Ah, good. Sorry, I lost you. Sorry, I just lost my screen. Oops. Sorry, Joe, and everyone. I've got to find. I've just had something happen, and I will find the presentation I was going to talk about. If you can just bear with me for a minute.
Sure.
Worst thing to happen when this happens, isn't it?
Please take your time. This is climate change webinar.
Yeah.
Your computer also changed.
Well, it's wet tropics, so maybe that's why. I just have to reboot my PowerPoint. I'm sorry.
In the meantime, maybe I can ask a question from Gordon. One of the topical issues in tourism in general is seasonality. And so many articles have been published on seasonality, how to extend the season. And usually this is in reference to summer destinations. What would extension of seasonality in Arctic mean? I'm totally lost in that area. How could they extend their season? Would you define a season for us and extending it?
Yes, I can take, for instance, the case of Iceland, which is an interesting case in many ways. But what was done basically to because Iceland is not typical of this region in that, because we are on the Gulf Stream, we have a milder climate. So we do not have the snow cover and the ice and the visibility of the northern lights to as much extent as the northern part of Scandinavia. So what was done actually and what most of the destinations in the Nordic countries have done to increase visitation in their off-season, whether it be summer or winter, is that they have turned very much to events, festivals and events. We have a very strong pop music culture, and a music culture partly based on the fact that we have public music schools, that most of the big stars from the Nordic countries have actually at one point attended music school in a small village. And this has been I would guess the main tool to make the off season more interesting and to generate tourism flows. But of course that has been with the support and its partnership between private and public sector, because the municipalities are often heavily investing in the festivals, for instance. Does that answer your question? You're muted.
Yes, thank you very much. But what you suggested is similar to summer destinations. They also go for events and concerts and so on and so forth. But then they also have the option of conference business. Are you using that technique also in the polar system?
Yes. Conferences and events, actually, events is sort of, in my mind, kind of covers both conferences, the conference market, and also the festival market. Conferences are, of course, often set in the off season because it makes travel to those destinations more economically viable. But with conferences, there is always this issue of peripherality. If you're having a conference in a small community, there is very often a limit to how big can the conference be in terms of how many beds, for instance, you have available for visitors, for tourists. Whereas many of the festivals that have been hosted, even if you take the G Festival in the Faroe Islands, in Götu, which is a very, very small community, this is a huge festival, but it's in summer, and most of the guests are actually camping. You take Trena here in Norway. It's a remote, very small island, and the festival goers come very much for the experience of a spectacular landscape as the backdrop for the popular music. But those are communities that are so small that they have difficulty adapting to mass tourism, and often there becomes it becomes an issue with how big can this festival grow, how much income does it really generate, what is really the benefit of the community. And so we have done some research on that. I have a colleague in Iceland who has been doing, for instance, long-term research on a small town festival that has become very, very popular, but the managers have had to really work hard to make it still socially sustainable, so that the local population doesn't feel overwhelmed.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay,
Bruce?
Yeah.
Yep, ready.
Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready to go.
Great. Thank you very much. Perfect. We can see it.
Okay, so apologies for that before. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon for some people. It's very early morning over this way, so it's summer. So unlike in Norway, it's about 27 degrees outside, and it's just past midnight here. So interesting looking at the different climatic conditions. So we rely on climate as well here. One of the interesting things I think, though, is when we look at how we react, and I guess I'm looking at long term. I think a lot of the climate change work we look at in destinations, it's relatively short term. I think some of the big issues we really have to think about is we have no idea when global temperatures will stabilise, and we don't know at what level. So that makes it really difficult when you come for planning. We don't know where the various tipping points are. So, for example, in my area of the world, we have cyclones, and they're getting stronger. So there's one currently in the Pacific at the moment bearing down on a very small destination called Norfolk Island. Beyond that, it will go, and looks like it will probably sometime later in the weekend will hit New Zealand. So these various tipping points, we just don't know what will happen. We don't know when one happens, how it will cascade onto others. And also destinations, I guess where I live, it's not a small destination, it's about 170,000 people. So size-wise, it's not big, but it does get quite a few visitors coming in, several million. So unfortunately, destinations like mine, which are really based on nature, have very little power to mitigate. So we must really focus on adaptation. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a couple case studies of how natural areas, which are the key attraction to this region, have focused on adaptation rather than mitigation. So where I come from is in Cairns. It's right up towards the east coast of Australia, top of the continent. It's located in the wet tropics. So at the moment we're in the wet season, we get lots of rain, humidity is fairly high. It's a coastal location, and we rely on nature-based attractions. And I'll just run through a couple of those to give you an idea of what's happening and how we're dealing with those. So that's a sort of view. I live near a beach, and that's the beach where, just up from me, it's a beautiful spot. Only trouble is during summer we have sharks and stingers and jellyfish and so on, which makes it difficult. So the winter is the best season to come here. So that's where we look at. We have an average stay of about 7 nights for internationals, about 5 for domestics. One of the problems we face in Cairns is, as climate change continues to roll through, we're going to lose our airport, at least in high tide, by about 2070 or 2080. So this is the projection of what we're likely to face. So you can see in the top, just towards the left of the screen, you can see where the airport is. And then you look down, you can see down in this region here, there are a lot of hotels. All of those will face inundation within the next 50 years. So how do we overcome this? And these are the sorts of things, I guess, that as a destination we have to look at. So I'm not going to focus just on this, on the idea of how do we defend ourselves or what do we do, particularly things like airport, which for us, being a remote destination, is the most important transport asset. About 60% of people who come here come by air. But yeah, what I want to focus on, I just wanted to give you an idea of the difficulties we face, but now have a look at the main key attractions that we have. So one of them is the Great Barrier Reef. It's a wonderful area. It's very long, world's largest coral formations, but it's under threat. So from probably in the last decade, we've had a whole series of coral bleaching events. And this slide just shows you some of those coral bleaching events. Coral bleaching really means that the coral itself expels its the algae that's with it and eventually dies. So it bleaches, it becomes white. So from about 2014, there's been a whole series of these bleaching events, and you can see it's global right through. This is a couple slides of two of the most severe ones we had a couple of years ago in 2016, 2017. We've had some, and we could have another one this year with water temperatures being fairly high. So you can see the length of the Great Barrier Reef, it's a couple thousand kilometres. You can see here with the scale. And you can see what happened with bleaching. Now, coral at about 1.5 degrees increase in water temperature over historic levels will start to really decline quite considerably. At 2 degrees, we're likely to lose most of the coral. So at the moment, we're about 1.1 degree temperature. So we're starting to see these bleaching events, we get recovery, but the coral takes 5 or 6 years to recover or longer. If you get a lot of bleaching events, as we see here, these two, 2016, 2017, it certainly causes lots of problems. And this is one of the main attractions for the destination, and not just this destination, but others up and down the Queensland coast. So the coral, well, the Great Barrier Reef is administered by an authority called the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. I thought it'd be interesting to just sort of indicate to people that the strategies that have undertaken by this authority. So their approach to managing the marine park is adaptive and future focused. So it's based on building partnerships, etc., building the capacity of managing the whole region. One of the things we've really looked at is crown of thorn starfish. It's a natural phenomenon, but it has been fairly, it's killed a large amount of the reef over the last 20 or 30 years, partly because of climate change. The water is better, is heater, it's hotter, and it has allowed these animals to bloom and sort of cause great numbers of outbreaks. So a lot of money is spent on killing these particular starfish because they're killing the reef. We have a system called Eye on the Reef where we ask visitors to make their own comments, and they can go on a website. So you've got several million people going on the reef from the top to bottom each year. If they want, they can be almost like volunteer observers, and they can say, well, the reef is better or worse. There's a whole lot of other protection that's been going on, such as protection of high-value sites. There's been coral regeneration going on. There's a lot of rezoning that occurs. So there are areas where only scientists are allowed to go. The idea is to develop little colonies or little nurseries where we can regenerate the coral. We can take coral from those areas and transplant them into others. There's significant investment in research. It's been well over $1 billion Australian. So a lot of money is spent on that. A lot of money is spent on reducing runoff from farms, such as fertilizer and those sorts of things. So it has cost the farming community somewhat some money. They've had to redesign the way that they do their farming. So there's a whole lot of work that goes on to the Great Barrier Reef. But unfortunately, because we don't know when climate change will finish, we don't know what level it is, we really don't know what's going to happen to the future of this particular resource. And it's a great resource for a great number of areas in the of Queensland, particularly where I come from. So again, the policy has been adaptive and future focused. So it's based on doing the best we can. We realise what's going to happen. Hopefully we will be able to save some of the reef. What will be the implications for tourism? So it's a very long-term view. The other major asset we have is the wet tropics rainforests. These are enormous forests. Some of the areas go back to, in the species, back about 60 million years to Gondwana. So it's a very old forest, very beautiful forest, but again, it's under threat. This table was done by one of the local scientists, I think it's really quite interesting because it shows the current system was about 20 years ago. At 1 degree change, you can see the change in the species richness. You have to excuse me, I've broken a tooth, so a little bit difficult talking. So you'll see here, this was 20 years ago. You can see the black area is the richest species area. What's happened is, as the temperature has increased, a number of species have moved uphill, so they've moved up mountain. But of course, mountains cease at a certain level. And so what's happened is a lot of the animals are very specialized, a lot of the fauna is very specialized, and flora, it's moving up the mountain, but of course it can't go beyond the height of the particular mountain or the upland area. So you can see that at the moment, there's not been a great deal of problems. So we start to think we're starting to lose some species, but you can sort of get an idea of what's going to happen in the future as climate change continues, what will happen to the species richness of this sort of forest. So the Wet Tropics Management Authority is an interesting authority. What their adaptation plan is basically, you notice it's adaptation. It's accept, act, and adapt. So it's accepting that it's happening. It's saying, what can we do? How can we preserve? We don't know when climate change will finish. We don't know at what level temperatures will rise, so we don't know when that will occur. So it's trying to preserve as much as we can over a period of time. So there's a series of principles to engage with the community for management of adaptation. So it's really getting the community on side. There's another idea of let nature take its course. So we know it's going to happen. How do we preserve as much as we can? And we consider interventions where adaptation is not possible. So the idea is to try and keep species if we can. We know we're going to lose some as the temperature increases. So there's a whole lot of work that's done on basically looking at establishing regional adaptation planning frameworks. There's a lot of research that goes into the animals, into the flora and fauna, and the management that goes with that. So local council is another important asset, I guess, for the region. Now, local councils in Australia don't have a great deal of power. They have some planning power, but relatively minor when it comes to climate change. So the local council we have in the Cairns region is leading the community by example. So between 2010 and 2020, the local government authority reduced its CO emissions by about 46%. So we've been working at this for some time. So the plan is to achieve net zero emissions by 2030 through a range of strategies such as hybrid cars, eventually electric cars, solar power, green supply chains, and so on. And also to introduce new planning regulations in relation to construction. So there's an emphasis encouraging people to put solar panels, etc., in there. Local community is really important, I think, within the local government to get people to understand what's happening with climate change, because we know that in the future, and you saw from that first map that I showed what's happening with the coastal areas, we really face inundation of significant parts, including the airport, of this destination in the next 50 years. So it really is an important thing to get the community behind. And how do we adapt? So some of the barriers that we face in this region is previous federal government. So Australia's got a federal system of government. It was dominated by climate skeptics. So it's been really difficult for a long period of time at federal level, at national level, to introduce climate change or effective climate change measures. Local governments, unfortunately, have limited powers. Fortunately, we've changed the federal government now, and so we're starting to see a lot more vigorous action to look at climate change and to do what we can to mitigate as much as we can. One of the problems we find at local level in destinations such as ours, plus the state, and we have 3 tiers of government here, local, state, and federal, is basically we've got climate change is a long-term problem. It runs over decades, it runs over generations of people, but we have very short electoral cycles. And so that's one of the problems. It's the issues of today that often take precedence over the issues of tomorrow. So these are some of the issues I think we all face. How do we overcome some of these issues? And as I said, with climate change, it's an inter-decade and it's an intergenerational issue. And the short-term electoral cycles really work against that. So there's some really big issues that we have to deal with. Also, many of the key stakeholders are concerned about their share price. For example, mining, oil companies and others, they're all in the short term. So they're looking at the short term rather than the long term. again, it's only through legislation that I suppose we can overcome this issue. In a remote, and we are reasonably remote, it's over 20 hours to the UK, it's 20 hours to Europe, to America and to Japan, it's only 6 or 7 hours, quite a short little hop. But we face a core periphery problem here. So we're in the periphery. Many of our key destination investors don't live in the destination. So for example, the airport, which is the main way of bringing tourists in, it's the biggest investment in the area. The board, not one member of the board of directors lives locally. So the decisions that are made that affect our destination are generally made elsewhere. All the hotels are international chains. So again, the decisions that affect the livelihood of people within my destination, and I guess many destinations like this, are made either outside of the state that I live in, within somewhere else within the country, or even overseas. So it really is a problem for the local people. How do you overcome this issue when many of the important decisions that are made by somewhere we don't even know? They could be made in New York, they could be made in London, Paris, or somewhere else. One of the issues we really got, I guess, have to fight here is that many of the tourism stakeholders, such as the tourism operators, are locked into the sort of the current destination structure. They don't see the need to change. So this leads to path dependence, the short-term investment cycle that people look at. So we end up, a lot of operators don't really see the need to change because it's 10 or 15 years or 20 years down the track before these things happen, before the reef becomes probably unviable. And so we don't get as much support from the industry as we would like. So these are some of the barriers that a destination such as where I come from face. Now, some of the drivers have changed, and I think we've really got to understand what drivers do. They push the agenda, they can push politicians. So public opinion is starting to change. We do a lot of survey work in my destination. We see that people are very concerned. We've done longitudinal work, and we can see that there is a change. In fact, the last federal government we had in Australia was basically thrown out because of their climate change policy. So nationally, there's been this recognition that we really do need to do something about our climate. Where I come from, increased insurance premiums will become a real issue. We have cyclones and there were windstorm. Insurance in my house has gone up because I live near a beach by about 300% over the last 8 or 9 years. And in fact, with the insurance premiums will continue to rise so that some areas will not be insurable. Some businesses won't be insurable. So in that sense, it's the market that's driving the way that we will adapt and we will respond. There's a lot of concern about impacts of extreme weather. As I said before, we've got a cyclone that's in the Pacific that's approaching Norfolk Island. We have lots of those. Each year, about this time of the year, we really get nervous up this way because there could be a cyclone or there might be something like that that hits. But apart from extreme weather, we have floods, heat waves. We've had those in Australia at the moment, cyclones, drought. All of these factors impact on destinations such as ours. Changing government is another one of, fortunately, the change we've had in Australia recently has been a favourable change, but who knows in the future. So governments play a really important role, and that's the problem of the electoral cycle. We do a lot of science in the area. So with those 2 areas I showed you, the wet tropics and the Great Barrier Reef, there's a lot of science that goes behind that. So we've got very good science from the universities and from the national research institutions. So we understand what's happening, and that really helps in developing what you're going to do or your response with tourism. And the other thing that we're starting to see is there's a changing demand from visitors. So they want more climate-friendly experiences. We've been picking this up with the survey work that we've done. So what we come up with, this is a very quick little overview of what we've come up with. It's a work we've been doing. What we've looked at, we started a long-term sort of process. We look at the destination elite, the power brokers of a destination. Some live within the destination, some outside. What do they think? And really that's where we need to start. And then we work through with a series of interviews and basically looking at a whole range of issues. So we've got down to about number 5 on that area. So we're looking at the resilience based on the scenarios that come out from the IPCC. We haven't had funding to do the rest of the work that we'd like to. So look, I'll leave it there. That basically gives you an idea of the sorts of ways that you can respond. And this little table, which we've published, and unfortunately the references have gone up where it should have gone, but it is published. It is a little table. It's something that any destination can adopt, I think. So thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruce. Now time is pretty short. I guess past fast now. We already do the talk for over an hour, and I see some interesting question from the audience, like a social justice question from Willie, and also I see the question from Gabriel. So Willie, you want to say something regarding your question about social justice? Okay, that's okay. Let me just see first a message like people. I cannot talk right now. Okay, that's okay. Okay. Let's just try to host some question. Anybody have any question?
Okay,
So
sorry about that. Sorry, Joe. I
no
wasn't
problem.
able, yeah, thanks very much.
Okay.
I wasn't able to start the video, but I don't know, now it's working. So thanks
Great.
very much to both Gudrun and Bruce. I thought this was extremely interesting. Yeah, my question was more, I mean, it wasn't a question. It was more actually at the introduction when Kazem was talking about, you know, how do we deal with issues of climate change? It was more of a generic statement. And I mean, it's becoming clearer and clearer that in fact, it's very hard to deal with climate issues on a global scale when social justice is not present. I mean, this is what basically transpires across many of the research now. And it was more of a generic comment at the start. It wasn't really linked to any of the presentation per se. But I mean, if somebody would like to comment on this, I mean, I'd be happy to get the feedback, but.
Great.
I see that I have a question in the comments felt. Question to Gudrun. To your understanding, does a warming climate also hold any opportunities in terms of new Arctic foods, meaning foods that perhaps so far could not have been grown or produced, but in the future could be? Will we perhaps see a move north of what we understand as traditional local food? Yes, of course, there will be adaptation, but it means that the foods that we, or the food sources that we have traditionally used and that have been marketed as our traditional foods, such as berries and fish and seabirds, seals, whales, different fish. When they move north, we have less accessibility. Some of these species will actually degenerate to the extent that they will no longer be harvested. But when species move north, well, yes, for instance, mackerel is moving north into the North Atlantic, and people are now fishing mackerel in places where it wasn't available before. But that is not traditional. It will take some time to adapt to new food sources. So this is nothing that will happen like in the lifespan of, say, one restaurant to create completely new traditions. But in terms of social justice, this is also quite an important issue for the Arctic, because first of all, there are indigenous communities that have traditional rights that need to be respected. For instance, here in Norway, we have the Sami and their reindeer herding culture. But there is also an issue in many of the Arctic and Nordic areas, same as globally, is that there is a social justice issue between the center and the periphery. often the large urban centers, capital regions, large cities, they are economically advantaged compared to rural areas, and regional policies, national policies for supporting the community, supporting the business ecosystems in rural areas is, you might say that is also a social justice issue.
Thanks very much, Gudrun. That was my question. That was very interesting to hear your comment. If you don't mind, could I just ask another question on that? Joseph, is that fine with you?
Yes. So, okay, very good. So thank you so much for your question from the floor. Any other people have any question?
Dr. Chen, I see without a break, the hot conversation and discussion is ongoing. I'm enjoying. There are some interesting questions in the chat to Dr. Gordon. One of them is simply is suggesting new climate and new food. Do you think that climate change in the north on Arctic environment means that we have new opportunities to grow new food and new food culture?
Yeah, I was kind of trying to answer that before, and I think Gabriel has a follow-up question to that. So maybe he could pose that.
Yeah,
follow-up.
Thanks. I was just wondering, this concept of what's been taken as traditional food, I find it a very difficult concept, because how far back do you go to say, oh, this is traditional? So I don't know, in Germany, let's say we say, oh, Riesling, that is a very traditional wine. Well, it's only been traditional ever since the Romans came and brought Riesling to us. If you go further back, you might say that wine has never been traditional German, and so forth. So I find your comment very, very interesting on saying, well, this traditionalizing of something that will come up and be a new food due to climate change and the new rising opportunities to grow new food, that exceeds the lifetime of a restaurateur. I think that's a very, very valid comment. But I'm sort of interested to hear your opinion on whether or not, from your point of view, like how long will it take for tourists to, in a way, accept the fact that the destinations they are going to will change dramatically? Because, there will be a time where in Germany we won't be able to grow Riesling any longer because it's not cool enough. And there will be a time where, I don't know, in Iceland or Norway, you can say Arctic char, I'm sorry, but it's not growing anymore. But we have very good Riesling. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, well, there'll be that time. And I'm wondering whether or not you see countries sort of come to terms with this.
I cannot put a time frame on it, but of course, heritage, the traditional, the classic Hobsbawm and Ranger definition of heritage is that heritage is always constructed. It is our selection. We select from our culture and our history and our past what it is that we want to emphasize. So we are always in the process. I mean, we cannot take traditions for given or cultural heritage for given. Natural heritage we have not as much control over, but cultural heritage is cultural. It is a construction. So yes, there will be probably a time. Unfortunately, not perhaps in my lifetime when I can taste Icelandic Riesling, but there is actually a vineyard here near me in Bø. But it is, and I think the market, what the tourists expect is, of course, very much what the market tells them to expect. So if one of the adaptation strategies of tourism must be a reconsideration of how we market the destinations, because we cannot market them on the basis of attractions that no longer are attractive. So if we start changing the marketing of these destinations, yes, then the expectations of tourists will change. But it is as mentioned before in this session. It's cultural. It has to do with to what extent do we actually accept that these changes are happening. I think in Bruce's presentation, this strategy to accept, act, and adapt, that is something that is a strategy that perhaps is not yet as widespread as it should be. That we need actually to be prepared and maybe a bit more alert to the fact that we cannot promise the same as we promised 5, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, in terms of experiences.
Great, thank you very much.
May I have a question for Bruce, if Dr. Chen accepts?
Sure, please.
Bruce, you mentioned about climate change and the sustainability issues and the effort by local governments and so on. So I want to know how much local communities can be involved and how much does it really affect. Climate change is global. So I know thinking global and acting local is the solution, but how does in reality it makes sense, and how we can convince local communities to incorporate this policy in their livelihood?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question. If you take not just the local community, but you take an aggregation of all the local communities in Australia, recently they've thrown out a government because of basically one of the big issues was climate change. So local communities understand that it's not just they can't do much about it, it has to be a national issue. And so local communities, I think people overall understand that these are real problems. So they seek to change governments at the top, and that works its way down to local communities. Here in Queensland, the government has been fairly proactive, the state government proactive in encouraging encouraging all local communities to become climate conscious and to adopt various strategies. So there's been a whole series of workshops over the last quite a few years looking at what's likely to happen, where's the infrastructure, where does it have to be moved, and so on. So there's a whole lot of work, and I think local communities, particularly in this area, I start to understand. We've had lots of floods in Australia in the last couple of years. We've had bushfires. So there's a very, I think, a growing consciousness, particularly in younger people, but also of older people, that we do need to do something about this. And so that was expressed through the ballot box. So I think at local level, people understood, so they changed the person that represents them, either local, state, or federal government. So I think that's how it's occurring. And then also people are saying, we need to do something about this. What are you going to do? And they're putting that onto government. And governments are starting to win at all levels, are starting to win elections because of what they're promising about how they're going to deal with climate change. So I think that's a really positive thing, particularly in Australia, about what's happening. People are alert to it, and they're really pushing their politicians to do something about it.
Okay. Carson, is the question satisfy your, the answer satisfy your question?
Yeah, I think Bruce, you're right. So it's raising sensitivity to the local resources and bring more people into. I think it's also a source of community empowerment to raise voices and make their voice reach by local government. Thank you very much.
And I think as academics, we've got a role in that. So in my area, my team, we do a fair bit of work looking at those things, looking at what visitors think. We try to get the industry and also the local authorities to understand that. So survey work is a really good way of doing that, actually gathering real data and then giving it to local authorities. So that's part of what, as a tourism community of research, is something that we can do, is to give that sort of information to local authorities, and then local authorities start building that into their long-term planning. As I said, my destination, where we face losing our airport within 50 years through at current levels of climate change with the increase in temperature. We look at losing the Great Barrier Reef, which is one of our key draw cards within the next 20 or 30 years. So it's very real for us. And I think many members of the community are starting to realise that and starting to push governments to do something about that and saying, governments, we want you to spend money. We want you to do mitigation, and we want you to do an international voice rather than a national voice as well. So I think what we need to do is we need good science and we need good social science. And so as social scientists, we can inform governments about what will happen, what people view, resilience, what's the community think about these things, what do the visitors think about it. And the scientists also, amazing amount of good science, particularly in the area I've got, and it's up to the social scientists to take that science and then to run that with that to see what will happen in tourism and other areas. So I think there's a lot of stuff that as academics, and Jafar mentioned this before, I think there's a lot of things that we can do. We can provide information more than anything else. We can also understand what people think, and we can then take those things and we can give that to the community.
Yes, exactly. And I think one of the lessons that we can get and share is how these experiences might benefit other communities. So particularly in Japan, people are worried about the future climate change, temperature rise, and the possibility of having natural disasters like big fires that you had experienced in Australia. And they are now seeking that how they can get this knowledge for risk management from or by the Australian example and experiences. I've been in touch with some local government in Japan that they're approaching to see what they can learn from your experiences. So what do you think, how the communities across the globe, they can share this experience of resiliency and climate change management?
I think that's very important, actually, yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Chen, back to you.
Yes. Okay, anybody have any question for the speaker? Okay, I don't.
Can I just
Yeah. Right.
Can I just add a little bit to the discussion on heritage and food? It was a thought-provoking question, and my answers were based very much on what was is perceived as traditional, as going back to the farming society, back to even further than that. But I just was reminded while I was answering of a discussion that I had with a colleague here. We have a department here of outdoor recreation and friluftsliv, the Norwegian term for outdoor living. And it is a modern tradition, maybe not more than 50 years old in Norway. When you go skiing, cross-country skiing, which is very popular, the traditional commonly people take an orange, which is of course not a native species in Norway, and a chocolate bar that is similar to Kit Kat, as the and you might say that this is traditional, the traditional food you take with you on the ski trip. And I spoke of it in those terms, and one of my colleagues was very offended and said, well, this is not traditional. And of course, the traditional would have been blueberry soup. So it depends on the time scale. So while it may not be in the restaurateur's lifetime that mackerel will be a traditional food in Iceland, food trends can actually take a shorter term perspective. So you mentioned Riesling going back to the Roman era. That's a fairly long-term perspective, but food trends can actually take much shorter time, and maybe some of these food trends will actually become traditions.
Thanks very much for the additional comment.
Good. Okay, I guess time is pretty short. We try to move to the next agenda, so I try to pass that to Cousin for the other program.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm enjoying this hot discussion. It's very unique in its nature this time in the SCoT webinar. And I just want to share, before I pass the floor to our other colleagues here, Professor Jafari and Malcolm, I want to share an experience here in Japan that there are some movements on food and traditional food, if we call it, which is more focusing on medicinal plants and edible plants. I'm living in a city which is in the south of Japan, in Oita Prefecture, and we have about 200 species of medicinal and edible plants. That out of it, maybe 10% of that is used right now in the local recipes, but it used to be much more. So this food culture that changed, people forgot or they lost the traditional knowledge which plant is edible or not. And the recent natural disaster and resiliency or community resiliency management has brought the idea of using medicinal and edible plants back to the recipes. And they started to assess the varieties and this medicinal plant diversity, and they found that many of them are lost or there are new species and so on. So I think food and searching for local resources for food culture and food tourism is also a subject that is extremely related to climate change and getting local knowledge and community resiliency. Maybe I pass it on to Gordon again to see how she elaborated.
Well, thank you, but it's we've focused a lot on food, and that's maybe very much in line with the policies in the Nordic countries, because there's a lot of interest and very much a focus on how the food system, how the contemporary food system is both contributing to climate change and what could be done. There are issues such as grazing, the grazing of farm animals that can either be seen as in some research shows that it actually is helpful in terms of maintaining ecosystems to have grazing animals. But large-scale industrial farming has, of course, become under scrutiny for the way in which it may increase CO2 emissions, and so the food system, not just food as a tourism resource, but the whole food system is extremely important in terms of understanding and in terms of the impacts that we humans have on the climate. So these questions are, of course, very pertinent, and it's taking things down to sort of the level. But perhaps the focus then shifts from what has been called traditional food to saying, well, what is local? What is grown here? What is it that we have at hand? But then again, it's not as simple as it might seem to say, well, local food is necessarily better for climate emission. For instance, in Iceland, we might say that the tomato, which is of course not an indigenous plant, but can you say that it's traditional in Iceland because we have all this geothermal energy and all the greenhouses? So most of the tomatoes, a great deal of the tomatoes actually consumed in Iceland are actually grown in Iceland. So the question is, to what extent are these, is it traditional or is it local that we're talking about? Are we talking about something that is sustainable in terms of the way in which things are produced and marketed and transported? Is perhaps a more important question.
Thank you very much. Jafar, you are quiet. I'm going
Well,
to.
I came to this session to learn, not to, this is not my subject area. But tradition connects also to authenticity. When something is, we call it authentic. This reminds me of an article published in Annals of Tourism Research about Disney. Then after we have Disney Paris and Disney China, etc. The one in Las Vegas becomes the authentic one, the real one. So it depends where the beginning is. As a couple of you already said, where is the starting point? And the authenticity and tradition is connected to date. But I wanted to go to a subject somewhat outside, but then I bring it inside of climate change. There are a number of issues in tourism which are beyond the control of tourism. We are very good in dealing with management, marketing, operation, etc., things that we can control. But there are things outside of tourism that we cannot control, and those things control tourism. For example, war and peace. Without war, we cannot have tourism. With all the knowledge you may have about tourism, if there is war, there is no tourism. When there's earthquake, there would be no tourism. So, of course, climate change is also a problem, which is not caused necessarily by tourism. Tourism contributes to it, but it's not causing it. So how can we, my question is, we have knowledge about all of these areas, but the problem is that knowledge is warehoused on university campuses, and they are not fed, they are not transferred into the fields of practice. I think that is the problem. Do we know enough about climate change? Yes. Is this knowledge transferred to the operators? I don't think so. Not just climate change, any subject. We have 450 journals in the field of hospitality and tourism. What percentage of knowledge that is being circulated among these journals is going to hospitality and tourism? Should the government be involved? But the government every 4 years changes and the policies would change. Who is going to transfer the knowledge from these warehouses of knowledge or intelligence to the fields of practice, especially to the small communities, small operators who are simply caring about their daily activities, and they cannot and do not think beyond that. So the transfer of knowledge is an issue, has been always an issue for me for the last 10, not always, since 10 years ago. I've been focusing on transfer of knowledge and claiming that there is no transfer between academia and the industry. Very, very little transfer. So my point is, what lessons have we learned on the study of climate change and tourism, and how can the industry benefit from the lessons learned and do better? So in a way, I'm asking a question rather than having an answer myself.
I think part of it's through our students. A lot of the work we do with the postgrads that we had before COVID, we used a lot of local research, and so we put that into the course. So the students were actually getting a lot of that, and I found, particularly my destination, there was some sharing of knowledge. So we do get out into the industry. For example, I'm on a couple of local boards, so I bring my research into those areas and they look at that. And that's why they put me on those boards, to bring their research. But it comes down to academics. I think have got to have work that is interesting to the industry and have got to make themselves available. And I think a lot of academics perhaps don't have the opportunity to do that or don't look for that. I think it's us that have got to go to the industry. We go directly, or we go through our students, or we go through the alumni. And I think there's more and more students getting jobs and they're sort of working their way up through the industry. So I think the industry is becoming more informed, and I think we've really got to do a better job at harnessing those students, our past students, that alumni, and giving them access to the research that we do.
But do you, I'm sure you agree with me that a small percentage of the courses that we are teaching are relating to climate change and broader issues. We basically talk about hotel management, restaurant management, marketing, promotion. Chinese market is coming, Chinese market is not coming. It's basically, these are the sort of things we are talking about. Efforts of the sort that Bruce, you're saying are excellent, but they are not enough. There is not enough of that in the curriculum. For example, Professor Jeffrey Lipman has started the Sonic Small Talk, and that one has students. I participated in one of those sessions. It's all about climate change and tourism. And of course, with this kind of initiative, we can slowly penetrate, slowly transfer the knowledge to the field of practice. But that's not enough. What I'm saying is that we have so much of knowledge, and the industry is just on its own. It's not connected to the academia, and they're doing their own trial and errors. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I think it really depends where you are. We make an effort to do that here, but we've got a subject, for example, on climate change. Well, the course was terminated during COVID, but hopefully it'll get back up and running. But by having units on or units on climate change, I think that's how we can do that, and we can bring industry in to our teaching, and we've also bring industry in through our research, but make them research partners. That's what we've tried to do anyway. Probably not as successful as I'd like, but you can see that the people are working their way through who've been students in the past, now starting to get senior positions in companies and organisations, are using research. They're used to looking for it, where to look for it. So we've got to make it more available to them, I think, but they know where to go. We just don't make it accessible as much as we should, I think.
I think it's it's a very valuable consideration. And Jafar, it's true that the majority of tourism programs are actually very much business as usual. But here at the University of Southeastern Norway, for instance, we have had for a long time a one-year program for international students, for exchange students, called International Sustainable Tourism. And it's now, 15 years old or something. The Master in Sustainability Management is really gathering momentum. So I think there is a call for this in the industry. There's a call for people with these skills. Whether the universities are quick to adapt to that call is another question, but I think it depends very much on where you are. In Iceland, for instance, there has been the opposite problem, that the universities have been criticized for our tourism programs. They're being maybe too concerned with global issues and theoretical issues, but there has always been this effort to try to balance the theory and practice, particularly with the rural tourism department, and also this combining that it also depends on what kind of target market you have for your programs. For instance, the programs in Iceland attract a lot of people who are already in positions in the industry, and they have different needs, and they have different, there's a more direct link between the knowledge production and then the what is happening in the industry. So that is something that we have been developing here at the University of Southeastern Norway, is what we call the industry masters. That is master's degrees that actually, where you actually are in the industry and you're taking your studies alongside your job. So that is just to mention the kind of formal. You can actually create programs that are actually based on the idea that you want things to go directly from your research projects into circulation in the community.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if we may, Joseph, I pass it on to Professor Cooper to wrap it up. Malcolm.
Hi, thank you very much, Karem, Jafar. And thanks to our panel, Joseph, Bruce, Gudrun, for setting out a program that actually derives from the nature of the small communities. It was very great to hear this constraint to talk about right at the very beginning, because it led our discussion into a number of very local things that we can do. Should remember that small communities are the largest number of destinations. They're the least resourced, perhaps the least adaptable, but they are the largest number. They suffer more direct if something goes wrong, and climate change is, of course, perhaps the paramount one of those. But I also noticed that Gudrun made a very interesting point. Small communities vary, and one valley to the next may be a different microclimate and a different impact. So we're looking at the direct links that we need to make with small communities. And practitioners are also part of that, but they're not built in, as most of you actually pointed out. So I'm very happy with the way the debate went. I think it points out a number of the important factors. I'd also like to say that perhaps it's unwise to try and keep older forms of tourism, and indeed older forms of community, when they're past their use-by date because of climate change. So I think we perhaps could leave it there, but it's a lot of things to talk about, core periphery and path dependence, all sorts of things that we should be talking about. And I hope this webinar has actually started the discussion yet again. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Malcolm. Before I pass it on to Dr. Chen to close the session, I would like to invite everybody first to watch the recordings of this webinar and the other webinars on the SCoT webinar YouTube channel. You can just subscribe on the channel and stay tuned. And the second news that I want to share is the next webinar that we have, and it is very related with this topic. It's about the globally important agricultural heritage systems. This is an initiative of UN FAO. And in that webinar, we are going to discuss about sustaining globally agricultural heritage system through tourism. We have administrators from UNFAO. They're explaining the system itself on the program, and some representative of these agri-heritage sites from Chiloé and Japan. And we would like to invite you to join us. It's in 2 days' time. you can simply register for this webinar in our website. Thank you again from my side, and back to you, Joseph, for your closing remark.
Okay, thank you so much, Colin. And also thank you so much for all the distinguished speaker and also honorable audience. And it is a great pleasure to host this series of climate change talk. And we find some problem and issue, that's good. And also talk about the transfer of the knowledge. That is a problem, and that is things that we have to deal with in the future. And we hope we can find a better solution to transfer those research knowledge to the small community, especially. And I thank everybody for your time and effort. I hope everybody have a great weekend. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And we are expecting you to bring your team again to this important topic in SCoT webinar series. We hope to see everybody again in this SCoT, and a special thank to Willie for joining us tonight again.
It's been great listening to everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joe, as well, for hosting this.
Talk to you soon, Bruce,
Thank
Yeah,
you.
will do.
about that book chapter.
Yeah,
Talk-
send us
Talk to
a
Mr.
link.
Kazem about that as well.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so
See you
much.
later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.